system as two main parts, the GI tract and accessory organs. The GI tract is a tube that goes from mouth to anus, and food passes through this tube. As it passes through, it's digested, nutrients are absorbed, and waste is expelled. The accessory organs are not part of this tube that food passes through, but they help the tube to digest food, many by secreting liquids into the tube. Take a few minutes and think about what life was like for your ancient ancestors, roaming around in the wilderness trying to figure out what to eat. Their tongue was very important for telling them what to eat and what not to eat. We know that you need carbohydrates and salts. And even though today we have an overabundance of those things and we tend to associate them with health problems, a million years ago, those types of nutrients were scarce and you needed them. If something tastes sweet, that indicates that it contains carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are a good source of energy. So it is something you would want to eat. So we are evolved to enjoy sweet taste. If something is salty, that means that it contains electrolytes. Electrolytes are also very important and tend to be scarce in nature. This is why we enjoy things that are salty. So we are also programmed to like eating things that are salty. A lot of things are poisonous. If you're out walking around in the woods, you have to be careful about some yummy looking berries. A lot of those yummy looking berries are actually toxic. Things that are bitter tend to indicate toxins. And that is why we do not like bitter things. If you get something bitter in your mouth, your instinct is to gag and spit it out. We don't like to eat things that are bitter, and this is an evolved response because a lot of bitter things are poisonous. Sour is the other main flavor. Now I know like there's those sour jawbreakers candies and lemonade and stuff that's sour that we do like. But in general, sour indicates foods that are spoiled. And that would not be something good to eat. Think of like sour milk. You wouldn't want to drink sour milk. You would have a reaction to spit that out, to vomit it out, because it would not be good for you. It's probably spoiled by bacteria. In addition to your tongue, your nose is also very important. Your sense of smell. Think about how often you smell something before you eat it. I know when I'm looking in the fridge for some leftovers and I find something that I'm like, well, it's kind of old, I'm not sure if it's good, I smell it. And if it smells bad, then you don't eat it. The digestive and respiratory systems share a pathway here. So we have to have some traffic control to control where air goes and where the bolus goes. First, let's look at what happens when you're breathing. So this first picture here shows breathing. Now notice there is a bolus, but the bolus is still in the mouth. So you can chew and breathe at the same time. When you're breathing, airway is open, so air can come in the nose, it can come down through the pharynx, and then it will go through here into the larynx. And from the larynx, it'll go down into the lungs. So we have the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, and then that would go to the trachea, the bronchi, down to the lungs. Notice that during this time, the uvula is down, and the epiglottis is up. Also, when you're breathing, the esophageal sphincters are closed. So you have an upper esophageal sphincter. It is closed while breathing in order to keep air out of your stomach. And you have a lower esophageal sphincter. Because of its proximity to the heart, it is also sometimes called the cardiac sphincter. It doesn't actually have anything to do with the heart. It's just near the heart. This sphincter is also closed while you are breathing. Now we can look at the picture that shows swallowing. So here's the bolus. When you swallow, you need to close off the airways. You definitely don't want that bolus going in the airway. That would make you choke and you could die. So the uvula goes up, and the purpose of this is to keep the bolus out of the nose. Maybe sometimes you've laughed while you were swallowing and then your drink comes out of your nose. That's because when you laugh, the uvula moves around and it can't keep the bolus out of your nose like it should. Also, the epiglottis goes down. So that it covers the larynx. This forces the food to go to the tube back here, which is the esophagus. So then the bolus would be here. It goes down the tube. So this whole tube right here is the esophagus. And it is a muscular tube that actually squeezes. It does peristalsis to push the bolus down. When you swallow, the two esophageal sphincters open. So the upper one will open to let the bolus into the esophagus. And the lower one will open to let the bolus into the stomach. And another important function of this lower one is that it keeps the gastric juice out of the esophagus. So all the rest of the time, except when you're swallowing, it is closed to keep the gastric juice out of the esophagus. This is important because gastric juice is acidic and it burns the esophagus. And this is what's commonly known as heartburn. So heartburn doesn't actually have anything to do with your heart. It's stomach acid getting up into the esophagus and burning the esophagus. It's just called heartburn because you experience that pain in your chest and your heart is in your chest.
Swallowing occurs in 2 stages, the oropharyngeal and esophageal stages. At the start of a swallow, a food bolus is voluntarily pressed by the tongue up against the roof of the mouth and backwards towards the pharynx. In response to activation of pharyngeal pressure receptors, the swallowing center in the medulla initiates reflexes that prevent food entry into respiratory passageways. The uvula contracts, which blocks the nasal passages from the pharynx. The laryngeal muscles contract, closing the glottis at the top of the trachea by tightly aligning the vocal folds. The epiglottis swings down upon the closed glottis. With all airways blocked off, respiration is temporarily inhibited. As the upper esophageal sphincter relaxes, pharyngeal contractions drive the bolus into the esophagus. The oropharyngeal stage is done and breathing resumes. During the esophageal stage, a primary wave of peristalsis initiated by the swallowing center pushes the bolus through the esophagus. As the bolus travels through the esophagus, the lower esophageal sphincter relaxes, allowing the food to enter the stomach. If the bolus is sticky and adheres to the esophagus, secondary peristaltic waves triggered by the intrinsic plexus at the point of distension completely clear the esophageal lumen to finish the swallow.
Now that the food has been swallowed, let's take a look at the stomach and see what happens to it. So remember we had a bolus is the chewed food that is swallowed. And it goes down the esophagus, so the bolus would be coming through here, through the esophagus into the stomach. So the stomach is this muscular container. It is made of smooth muscle, and it is basically a storage container for the food. There are several functions of the stomach. The main function of the stomach is this storage. Here's a short video to kind of show you how the stomach works.
Proceed. Okay. Ta-da.
So in that video, he wanted to carry all of the groceries at once. He didn't want to make separate trips. So the man was like the stomach. With your stomach, you can eat a bunch of food at once. Think about how much you eat in one sitting. Then your stomach holds several hours worth of food for you. So with their groceries, they could have just taken one bag at a time up to their apartment, then back to the parking garage and made several trips. Or they could just load all of the groceries up at once and go. That's what your stomach does. Instead of constantly having to eat, taking a bite every few minutes all throughout the day, you just load your stomach up and then you're good to go for several hours. If you think about animals have stomachs and how this works. Animals are predators and prey. So if you think about a predator wants to be able to hurry up and load its stomach because it has to eat quickly before its food rots. Or before scavengers steal it. or another predator. If you think about prey, in order for prey to eat, they have to go out in the open where it is dangerous, where they could become lunch for a predator. So they need to hurry up and load up their stomach and then go back into hiding. So the predator, after he's hurried up and filled his stomach, can then have plenty of hours to leisurely digest that food. And the prey, after he's hurried up and filled his stomach, can then have several hours where he's back in a safe hiding place to digest that food. So that's the main thing your stomach does for you. It gives you a storage tank, so you're not constantly eating. You can fill up your stomach and then you're good for several hours. Also, your stomach churns food. So it mixes it with gastric acid. You have gastric juice here in your stomach. And the bolus mixes with the gastric juice. And your stomach churns to mix them together. So churning is muscle contractions. To mix the bolus with the gastric juice. And this produces a liquid called chyme. So once that bolus is dissolved in the gastric juice, then you have chyme. When you vomit, that's chyme that you see coming up. Another function of the stomach is it has acid. The pH of gastric juice is about 2. And this is because it has hydrochloric acid in your stomach. This acid does 2 things. It kills germs. So your food is not as clean as you would like to think it is. Every time you eat food, you're also eating germs. And it denatures proteins. This makes the proteins easier to digest. Okay. A fourth thing that is happening in the stomach is enzymes working on digesting food. There's 2 enzymes that work in the stomach. Pepsin is an enzyme made in the stomach. And it will digest protein. It breaks proteins up into smaller pieces. Then you have that lingual lipase. You might remember this. It was in the saliva. So it's mixed in with the bolus while it's in the mouth. And then it is activated by the stomach acid. So then it starts working on digesting lipids when it's in the stomach. And both of these enzymes, pepsin and lingual lipase, are activated by the stomach acid. So if you recall from chapter 2, enzymes are a protein. pH is very important to the function of proteins. They'll only work if they have the correct pH. And these 2 enzymes are meant to work at that low pH of the stomach. Okay, when it comes to absorption, the stomach doesn't do much. Your small intestine does the majority of absorption, but your stomach will absorb alcohol and aspirin. This is why you get drunk so fast on an empty stomach, because if there's no food in there to absorb the alcohol, as soon as you swallow that alcohol, it goes right through the stomach into the blood. And the sixth thing is that the stomach makes intrinsic factor. Okay, think back to chapter 7 when you learned about bones and calcium. Remember we talked about calcitriol and calcium? What was the relationship there? You have the same relationship between intrinsic factor and vitamin B. You have to have intrinsic factor in order to absorb vitamin B from your diet. So an interesting thing here, you can have your stomach removed. This happens sometimes when people get stomach cancer. You can live without a stomach on one condition. If you have your stomach removed, you have to get injections of vitamin B. Because without your stomach, you would have no intrinsic factor, and then your intestine would not be able to absorb any vitamin B that you eat. And the other thing, if you have your stomach removed, you lose that storage capability. So people who don't have a stomach have to eat all the time. And they can't eat very much at a time. It's just basically snacking all day long. Let's look now at a gastric pit. The gastric pit is a microscopic, these are microscopic pits all along the stomach. And they have cells that produce things for the stomach. So we'll look at the different types of cells here and what they make. We'll start off over here. The orange ones and this pink one are mucus cells. So their name pretty much tells you what they do. They make mucus. So you can see here this kind of coating. So this is a slimy coating that protects the stomach. The stomach is full of acid and enzymes, and you have to protect yourself from that. So that's what this mucus does. These purple ones here are chief cells. The chief cell makes pepsinogen. This is an inactive form of the pepsin enzyme. So if we follow this arrow up, here is where pepsinogen would go. Once it gets out in the stomach and it mixes with the acid, it becomes activated to pepsin. And then this blue thing here is a protein. And here you can see digested protein. So then the stomach acid activates it. and then it will start to digest protein. Next, we have G cells. These, right here on the bottom, are G cells. G cells secrete gastrin into the blood. So you can see here, their arrow is going to the blood, and you have these little blue triangles. That is gastrin. They do this when food enters your stomach. So this is what happens when you eat. And gastrin is a hormone that goes into your blood and it travels through the body, but then it comes back and stimulates the stomach. So when you eat and you fill your stomach, then your stomach has a lot of work to do. And so when the stomach gets food put into it, these G cells detect that and they secrete gastrin into the blood. That flows through your whole body. The gastrin goes everywhere. And as it comes back to the stomach, it then stimulates the stomach to work harder. And then this one, our last one, is a parietal cell. This cell secretes three things. It secretes hydrogen ions and chloride ions. It secretes them separately. Then once they are out in the stomach, they combine to make hydrochloric acid. The reason you secrete them separately is if you made the hydrochloric acid inside the cell, it would kill the cell. You can't fill cells up with acid. So the parietal cell has to secrete them separately, let them combine once they are safely outside the cell. The other thing that the parietal cell secretes is intrinsic factor. And remember, this is what we mentioned that you need in order to absorb vitamin B. All right, so there's an overview of the stomach, its functions, and its secretions. The stomach is similar to the heart in that it has its own pacemaker. And this pacemaker stimulates it to contract. And your stomach contracts every 15 seconds, so 4 times a minute. This rate is set, so this 15 seconds doesn't change. But also like the heart, the stomach can be influenced by the autonomic nervous system. Remember, the autonomic nervous system has 2 divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Think back about the nicknames for those. Sympathetic is fight or flight, parasympathetic is rest and digest. So it's going to be the parasympathetic that's going to influence the stomach. And you won't change that 15 seconds, but you can change the force of contraction and the amount of gastric juice produced. And we call that increased motility. So parasympathetic increases motility, which means the force and the amount of gastric juice produced. So let's go through and look at 3 phases of the stomach. I'm going to use red and green here because 2 of them stimulate the stomach and 1 of them inhibits the stomach. So we'll begin with the cephalic phase. I'm going to show you a little video clip here to experience a cephalic phase. So, are you hungry now after watching that clip? Cephalic is when you see, smell, or think about food. You can actually make yourself hungry with these stimuli. So, seeing, smelling, or thinking about food will cause your brainstem to use the vagus nerve. So, this is the vagus. And it will secrete acetylcholine onto your stomach. Hopefully you remember this. We've talked about the vagus before, secreting acetylcholine. Okay, so ACH is something we've had before. It's what stimulates skeletal muscles to contract, it slows down the heart, and it increases motility of the stomach. So acetylcholine is stimulatory to the stomach. This might be when you hear your stomach growl. So if you're thinking about food and you're seeing food and you're getting hungry, you might hear that growling. That growl of your stomach is the forceful contractions because it's contracting harder now. And you also have more gastric juice. So those forceful contractions slosh that gastric juice around. And that's what you hear is your stomach growling. So this is in green because it's stimulating your stomach. It's making your stomach work harder. Next is the gastric phase. This starts once food enters the stomach. So if the cephalic phase was successful, it gets you to eat. So now you have food enters the stomach. Two things happen now. Notice here we have this sensory neuron going back this way. So one thing that happens is the stomach sends sensory nerve signals back to the brainstem. This would be part of that visceral sensory you learned in chapter 12. And this causes the brainstem to increase the vagal stimulation. So you're going to get more acetylcholine secreted onto the stomach. and this will increase the motility. The second thing that happens, remember we learned about G cells and gastrin? So down here, we have these arrows. These are showing gastrin. The G cells will secrete gastrin, and it goes into the blood, circulates through the body, comes back, and stimulates the stomach. So now, in the gastric phase, the stomach is really going. It has lots of acetylcholine, and it has gastrin stimulating it. So you're getting a lot of gastric juice, some very forceful contractions. Then it's time to start slowing it down. So the third phase is intestinal. As the stomach contracts, it pushes food through that pylorus. So remember, the pylorus is where the stomach connects to the small intestine. And that first part of the small intestine is the duodenum. There's a sphincter here that holds the pylorus closed. But every time the stomach contracts, that every 15 seconds, it pushes that sphincter open. And that allows about a tablespoon of chyme to pass through into the intestine. Now, a tablespoon is not very much at all. Your intestine purposely wants slow entry of the chyme. The intestine needs time to thoroughly digest the food. So it wants just little bits of chyme at a time. So it's going to get some chyme every 15 seconds. The harder the stomach is contracting, the more chyme it will push through. So your intestine wants to calm the stomach down and get that chyme, get those contractions to be less forceful so not too much chyme is pushed through. So now you need to calm the contractions. So now the small intestine is going to counteract everything that happened in the gastric phase. So you can see here we're going to inhibit gastrin, and we're going to inhibit vagal stimulation. And the intestine accomplishes this with two hormones of its own, CCK and secretin. So once chyme starts flowing through into the intestine, it wants to calm the stomach down so that it doesn't get too much chyme flowing through. So it secretes CCK and secretin. They inhibit the gastrin and the vagal stimulation, and you lose that stimulation of the stomach, and it still contracts every 15 seconds, but with less force. Now that you've learned about the stomach, it's time to move on to the small intestine. The first part of the small intestine is the duodenum. It's the first few inches of the small intestine. It's important because three things mix together here. One of them is the chyme from the stomach. So you can see that right here. So remember, the chyme is the bolus, and it has been churned with the gastric juice to make this acidic chyme. And every time the stomach churns, you push against that pyloric sphincter and you make it open. And about 1 tablespoon of chyme flows through each time the stomach contracts. So you're getting about 1 tablespoon of chyme flowing through here every 15 seconds. It needs to mix with some things that are going to help your intestine to digest the food. So the next thing we have is pancreatic juice. So this comes from the pancreas. So here's number 2. The pancreas is both an endocrine and exocrine gland. So in chapter 17, you learned about its endocrine function, which was to secrete insulin and glucagon to regulate blood sugar. Now in chapter 26, we learn about its exocrine function. Its exocrine function is to secrete pancreatic juice to the duodenum. So as a review, if you don't remember, endocrine is when you secrete hormones into blood. Exocrine is when you secrete something through a duct. So you have this duct right here that carries that pancreatic juice to the duodenum. And there's 2 important features of pancreatic juice. First of all, it is basic. It has a high pH. This is so it can neutralize the stomach acid. The second important thing about it is that it contains enzymes to digest the food. Our third thing that gets mixed in here is bile. You may have seen bile if you've been really sick and you're throwing up a lot and you get down to that dry heave stage and there's stuff that looks like egg yolk and you're thinking, I didn't eat any egg yolks, where's that coming from? That's your bile. So bile here is number 3. It is made by the liver. Now, between meals, this area right here where this duct connects to the duodenum is closed. And the liver is making bile, and we'll use a different color here so you can see. That bile comes down through here, and it gets to here and it hits a dead end. So it sits there. And the liver keeps making more bile. And as it does, it builds up. So this duct fills with bile. And then when it gets up here and the liver's still making more, it overflows here into the gallbladder and it fills the gallbladder. So your gallbladder stores extra bile. Then when you eat, this opens and it lets that bile into the duodenum. And when you eat, your gallbladder contracts. And that helps squeeze the bile that is stored into the duodenum. And bile is important. If you remember back to chapter 2, learning about amphipathic molecules, bile is amphipathic. That means that it has one end that attaches to water, and the other end bonds to lipids. So the bile is an emulsifier because it makes lipid and water mix. And this is necessary in order for you to digest the lipids that you eat. So here in the duodenum, you're mixing these three things together: the chyme, the pancreatic juice, and the bile. Then once those are mixed together, we continue on to the next two parts of the small intestine, which are the ileum and jejunum. So this is where you digest and absorb. So the digest part. You use enzymes to digest. And the enzymes come from two sources. So we already covered one, the pancreatic enzymes. The second one is called brush border enzymes. So on your intestines, you have villi and you have microvilli. The microvilli, when you look at them under the microscope, they kind of look like the bristles of a toothbrush. So that's why they're called the brush border. So the brush border is the microvilli. Think back to chapter 5 when you were learning tissue types and you learned about cells can have cilia or microvilli, but not both. And cilia are used for movement and microvilli are used for absorption. So the brush border has these microvilli and they contain enzymes. So you have two sets of enzymes working on digesting the food. Once the nutrients are broken down into small pieces and digested, then it is time to absorb them. Whenever you're absorbing something, you need lots of surface area. The more surface area you have, the more you can absorb. So the intestine has folds. If you look at this picture on the top, you can see it's not flat, it's all these ridges. So these are called folds. Here you can see the folds up close. And if you look at those folds, they have villi. So there are villi on the folds. And then, like I said, you can't see it in this picture, it's not magnified enough, but the villi have microvilli. So it would look kind of like the bristles of a toothbrush there. So that gives you lots of surface area to absorb the nutrients. Within those villi, you have blood vessels and a lymphatic vessel. So the nutrients, you have protein is broken down into amino acids. You have carbohydrates are broken down into glucose. And your lipids, you're going to get a lot of triglyceride. So think about what you already know. The amino acids and glucose are going to go into your blood. And that green thing right here is a lacteal. So you should remember this from chapter 21. It's a special type of lymphatic capillary that is going to pick up the lipids from your intestine. So as you go through the small intestine, that's where you do the majority of your digestion and absorption. That's where you have the most enzymes. They're getting that food all broken down, and you're getting that food absorbed. After food has been digested and nutrients absorbed in the small intestine, it is time to move on to the large intestine. This transfer takes place at the ileocecal valve, right here. So the ileum is the last part of the small intestine. Anything that wasn't digested and absorbed makes it to here. It passes through this valve into the large intestine. The material is then going to go up, across, and down through the colons. As it moves through the colons absorbs water and electrolytes. So when it enters, it is a liquid. And by the time it gets to the end, it is a solid feces because you're absorbing so much of the water out of it. The parts of the colon, the part where it goes up here on the right is the ascending colon because you're moving up. Then it goes across. This is the transverse colon because transverse means across. Then when the material is moving down on the left, that is the descending colon, descending for down. Then this curve here is the sigmoid colon. So those are the various parts of the colon where you absorb water and electrolytes and you turn that liquid material into a solid feces. An important substance to have here is fiber. This is why you need fiber in your diet. Fiber gives something solid for the colon to push against. If you don't have fiber, the material tends to get stuck. There's nothing for the colon to push, and it tends to just sit there. And movement through the colon tends to occur in what's called mass movements. So it's not a slow, steady movement like through the small intestine. It's rather a few times a day it moves a long distance. And these tend to be triggered by the filling of the stomach. So a lot of times emptying the bowels will occur right after eating. That's because when you fill your stomach, that triggers the large intestine to have a mass movement. It pushes everything along, and then you get stuff to the end ready to come out. Another important feature here is bacteria. So remember we talked about this in chapter 22. You have all those healthy bacteria. You have about 5 pounds of bacteria that live in your colon. And they're very important. They protect you. Remember the whole C. diff thing and the fecal transplant? So they protect you from pathogens. They help digest some food here. So there's a little bit of digestion still occurring here. And they make vitamins for you. There's even more recent research showing that they even help control your genes. They turn genes off and on. There's a link between the bacteria that live in your intestine and how you express your genes. In addition to the colon, there's some other parts of the large intestine. This area that hangs down below the ileocecal valve is called the cecum. And it's nicknamed the blind pouch because it's a dead end. Material comes in through the ileocecal valve and it moves up the ascending colon. This is just a little dead end hanging out down below there. And then this little thing hanging off of the cecum is the appendix. And it looks kind of like a worm, so it is also called the vermiform organ, because vermi means worm. So in humans, the cecum and the appendix don't really have much of a function. The appendix especially is just full of bacteria. And as long as these bacteria stay in there and behave, you're fine. But sometimes they can get overgrown, and if they escape from your intestine and get into your bloodstream, that's very dangerous. You definitely don't want any of these bacteria from the large intestine escaping from the large intestine. In other animals, like horses and rabbits that eat a lot of grass and hay and clover and such, they do use the cecum and the appendix. So like a horse, for example, has very large cecum, and there's several of them because they need it to digest all that hay. But in humans, since we don't eat grass and hay and clover, we don't really use it. Then the other parts, when you get here after the sigmoid colon, this is the rectum. And this is what stores feces. And then the anus is what expels feces. And if things go wrong in the colon, you can end up with either diarrhea or constipation. Diarrhea is when you don't absorb enough water. So this is where your colon failed to absorb enough water. And there's a couple of things that can cause it to fail to absorb enough water. One is if the material moves too fast. This tends to happen in response to an irritant. So if you eat something your body doesn't like, or if you have a pathogen that's irritating your intestine, you just try to hurry up and get it out. So that's why like certain people have certain foods that trigger them to have diarrhea, and they know they have to avoid those foods because that's an irritant to their body. And if they eat it, their body just wants to hurry up and get it out, so it makes everything move really fast to get that out. And in the case of a pathogen, that's protecting you from infection. If your body detects that there's a pathogen in your intestine that can hurry up and get it out of there, then that can protect you from getting sick. So a healthy adult who has a mild case of diarrhea, you're better off to just let it go, not take medicine to try to stop the diarrhea, because you're getting the irritant out of your body. Once it's out, you can recover and go back to normal. If you take like the Imodium or something to try and stop the diarrhea, you're just keeping that irritant inside you where it's going to keep irritating your body. The other factor is an osmotic. So think about osmosis. It's when water is attracted to something. So an osmotic attracts water. So if you eat an osmotic, then it will attract the water and keep it in your large intestine. An example of this, there is an artificial sweetener that for a while was used in gummy bears. They've taken these off the market now. Notice it says currently unavailable. But there for a while, people would buy these sugar-free gummy bears and then they would get terrible diarrhea. And people on Amazon, I think they got a little creative with this. So I think it started out as legitimate and then people kind of started embellishing their stories. But if you go on Amazon and look up these Haribo sugar-free gummy bears, there's some pretty funny stories here in the customer reviews about how these gummy bears give people diarrhea. And the reason for it is the artificial sweetener that's in these gummy bears is an osmotic. So you can have this like from artificial sweeteners. It can also happen like with sugar-free gum. If you chew too much, so a normal amount's fine, but if you just go overboard and you're like, I'm going to go through 5 packs of sugar-free gum a day, you could end up giving yourself diarrhea from the artificial sweetener in there. This is also why you can't let little kids have straight up apple juice. Those of you who have ever dealt with toddlers, if you give a 2-year-old a glass of apple juice, they will have diarrhea. This is why parents always dilute the juice with water, because the apple juice, a lot of fruit juices are osmotics. And little kids, their intestines just can't handle that much osmotic. And if they drink juice, they get diarrhea. This is also the idea behind Miralax. So Miralax is a laxative. It's used to treat constipation. So diarrhea is the opposite of constipation. If you're having trouble with constipation, you can take Miralax, and it's an osmotic. It'll pull water into the large intestine, and then that will help relieve the constipation. So then constipation is the other side of the spectrum. It is the opposite of diarrhea. So this is where the colon absorbs too much water. And this tends to be because the material moves too slowly. So since the material is moving slow, it's staying in the colon longer and you're absorbing more water from it. This is typically due to a lack of fiber. So if you don't have fiber, there's nothing for the colon to push against to make the material move. So it tends to just sit there, and as it sits, you keep absorbing more water. This produces a stool that is dry and hard. And then you kind of get into this downward spiral, this positive feedback effect. Because the stool is dry and hard, it is painful to pass. So people, especially children who don't quite understand the implications, when they get constipation, then they know it hurts to poop, so they try not to poop. They hold it in. Well, then holding it in only makes the problem worse. Now you create a blockage. Now you get more stool stuck behind this stool you're holding in, and then that stool gets dry and hard, and you can get all impacted with all this dry, hard stool building up in the rectum. So the best thing to do here is to just avoid the problem in the first place. Drink lots of water, eat lots of fiber. If you do get a dry, hard stool, even though it hurts to pass it, get it out of there, because if you hold it in, you're just going to make things worse. Another problem, and unfortunately it tends to go along with constipation, is hemorrhoids. There are veins in the rectum. So this is the rectum, and here are veins in the rectum. In chapter 20, we learned about varicose veins. Hemorrhoids are when these veins become varicose. So a varicose vein, remember, is swollen. So you get these swollen veins in the rectum. And then that makes going to the bathroom painful because the feces has to pass over those varicose veins and it hurts them. So if you get constipation and hemorrhoids together, it's kind of a double whammy. It hurts even more. You've got two different things causing pain. And sometimes also these veins can get so swollen that they actually hang out through the rectum. So best thing there, fiber, water, exercise, avoid getting this problem to begin with. Now we are ready to look at the peritoneum. This is a double layer serous membrane. So we've had those before. You first learned about this with the heart and the pericardium. So you saw how the heart was enveloped in this pericardium. So I had a sheet of cloth and I folded it in half, then wrapped it around the heart. That's the whole idea of the double layer serous membrane. You also learned about it with the lungs as the pleura. Now, with the digestive system, we have that same thing, and it is called peritoneum. So remember, you have a parietal layer that is against the body wall, and you have a visceral layer that is against the organ, and you have the cavity between the two layers, and this cavity contains serous fluid, which lubricates. So here is a side view of the digestive system. First, let's kind of get some context, figure out what we're looking at here. This is the stomach. This is the liver. Okay, so we're looking at a side view. This is a sagittal view. This is the transverse colon. All of this is small intestine. And just for some reference, like here's the rectum. This is the urinary bladder. And this is a uterus. So now you kind of have an idea of what you're looking at. The serous, the peritoneum, starts right here on the bottom of the stomach. I'm going to do a different color, it's better to see. I think green will show up. And it comes down like this, and then it folds, and it goes back up, and it attaches to the transverse colon. Then you also have all these parts of it here that attach to all the parts of the small intestine. So the part in front here, notice, is called greater omentum. So the greater omentum is also called the fatty apron, is its nickname. This is the part of the mesentery that hangs down from the stomach and transverse colon, just like how an apron hangs down from your waist. And it's called fatty because this is where you store a lot of fat. So this is where your belly fat is. Then these parts here that are holding the small intestine together are called mesentery. So mesentery is the part of the peritoneum that holds the small intestines. So you have like 30 feet of intestines in your body, and you don't want these intestines shifting around and getting tangled up. So it holds them in place, and it also contains the blood vessels and lymphatic vessels that go to them. So now you know all three of the double layer serous membranes in the body.